Hey, Econ 1B students. I had a request for going over the Assignment 9 quiz questions, so I'm going to go ahead and do that for you guys right now. This is probably a pretty good review of the most recent material looking at determinants of wages, right? The factors of production chapter where we talked about value marginal product of labor, and the other determinants of wages chapter where we talked about things like superstar phenomenon and human capital theory. So I'm going to switch the screen to my desktop and we can go over that one by one together. Let's go take a look. Okay, so here is the quiz. So the first question asks about the value marginal product of labor. And you want to remember the value marginal product of labor is how we determine the value of the marginal worker. So that marginal product is what they produce, and then the value of it is how much the firm can sell it for. So value marginal product of labor is going to be price times marginal product of labor, right? Because it's price times how productive that worker is. And so when we get that, what we get is the dollar value of the marginal worker. And we can compare that to their wage. And that's how we determine how many workers to hire. And that's why the value marginal product of labor curve is that labor demand curve. The next question looks at the derived demand. So which of the following describes how demand for labor in a given market is derived from the demand for the good or service that the labor produces? And the answer is derived demand. It's the idea that the demand for donut makers is derived from demand for donuts. The demand for car manufacturers is derived from the demand for cars. And it's one of these cases like we have in economics where we take a really simple idea and we have to name it something special. But derived demand just means that if you are a teacher, then demand for education is going to determine the demand for your labor. Question 3, the labor supply curve is upward sloping because people are more willing to supply labor to the market as wages rise. Most people enjoy working relative to leisure. Labor supply is not related to wages, or wages and leisure are equal. Looks like I've got a typo there and I'm missing a P. I apologize for that. But you want to remember the labor supply curve is upward sloping because I'm going to pull out a graph here. People are going to be more willing to supply their labor to the market as wages go up. So you think about yourself as an individual. Are you going to be more willing to work for higher wages or less willing? Right? So if wages go up, I'm going to be more and more willing to supply my labor to the market. So that's why we see an upward sloping labor supply curve. And then we add in our labor demand curve, which is equal to the value marginal product of labor. Right? Okay. Next question is a little bit more complicated. So a local coffee shop hires a barista and sees the quantity of coffee drinks sold increases from 20 a day to 35 a day. Thinking this is good for business, the owner hires another barista. This increases the number of coffee drinks sold from 35 to 40 per day. What is the marginal product of the first barista? So we've got two people, right? We've got the first barista, the second barista. The first barista takes us from 20 cups of coffee to 35. So 35 minus 20 gives us the the marginal product of labor for that first barista is going to be the additional 15 cups of coffee that the first barista contributes. The next barista takes us from 35 to 40. The question doesn't ask about that, but that's going to be a a marginal product of 5. So the first barista gives us an additional marginal product of 15 coffee drinks. The second barista gives us an additional marginal product of 5 coffee drinks. If we wanted to calculate the value marginal product of those workers, we would have to add in or multiply it by the price of the coffee. So if the barista is able to produce a marginal product of 15 coffee drinks and each coffee drink is worth $2, then that's a value marginal product of $30. Does that make sense? Next question. If a worker in a shop sells 10 pairs of sunglasses a day at $15 each, what is the value marginal product of their labor? So to calculate the value marginal product of labor, all you have to do is remember that it's just the marginal product of labor times the price of the good, right? So we have a marginal product of 10 and a value of $15. So all we have to do now is multiply 10 by 15. And that gives us $150. So the marginal productivity, the value of the productivity of this worker is $150. So the next question says, if the same sunglasses salesperson earns $15 an hour and works for 8 hours a day, is the shop rational to hire this worker? So what we need to do now is compare that $150 of marginal product to the cost of having that worker there. And so if it's $15 an hour times 8 hours, then the worker costs 8 times 15, or $120 in wages to keep them there. And so think about it. If you were the firm, would you be willing to spend $120 in wages to get $150 in value marginal product or in sales? Yeah, right? You're making money, right? That worker is making you money. The value marginal product is greater than the wage. So true, this shop is rational to hire this worker. A profit maximizing firm will hire workers up until the value marginal product of labor is equal to wages. So for example, in this case, this firm might even consider hiring another worker depending on what their value marginal product of labor is. If it is below 120, they won't hire them, but they'll hire workers up until the point where value marginal product of labor is equal to wages. So a profit maximizing firm will hire workers up till that point. And we can look at it and think about it here when we look at the next question. Question 8 looks at the market for pencil making labor. And you can see here that if you look at the demand curve being the value marginal product of labor, the equilibrium wage is going to be equal to the value marginal product of labor there. And so firms are going to produce where wage is equal to, or not produce, they're going to demand labor up until the point where wage is equal to value marginal product of labor at that demand curve in equilibrium. So this question says, compares the market for pencil makers with the market for pen makers. And it says the graph below shows the market for pencil makers. If workers decide to quit their jobs and start working at the more lucrative pen factory, what will be the effect on the pencil labor market? So I took the liberty of doing a little chart here. So here you can see the labor market for pen makers and the labor market for pencil makers. And the idea here is that wages are higher in the pen maker market. So if wages for pencil makers are $80 a week, maybe it's $100 a week for pen makers. And what that means, and what this question is trying to show, is the interconnectedness of labor markets. And so basically what we're seeing is if you had to decide, let's say you're a pencil maker and you're making $80 a week, and then you find out that you could move to the pen making market. You could go and become a pen maker and you'd make an extra $20 a week. You would do that, right? You would stop supplying your labor in the pencil market and start to supply your labor in the pen market. And so what that's going to do is, let me switch the screen here. It's going to go ahead and see the supply of labor decrease. Oh, sorry, not for pen makers. Decrease for pencil makers as more workers say, I don't want to be a pencil maker anymore, right? They're going to say, I'd rather supply my labor to the pen maker market. And so it's going to have the effect of decreasing the supply of labor in the pencil labor market and increasing the supply of labor in the pen labor market. And what that's actually going to do, if you look at that, it's going to raise wages for pencil makers because there are fewer workers willing and able to do the work, and it's going to lower wages for pen makers. And we'd probably see that happen until they've reached an equilibrium. But that's kind of a bigger idea than what we're talking about. The main idea here is if workers leave a single market to go and work in another market, that's going to affect supply. So if you are currently, let's say right now you've got a job working at a grocery store, and then you graduate and decide you'd like to leave that marketplace, stop being a grocery store worker and start working in an office, that's going to mean you're reducing the supply of labor in the market you're in right now and increasing the supply of labor in the new market, right? The market for another type of labor. So that's how you want to think about labor markets, is that they're interconnected, right? People can move from one labor market to another, and that's going to have an effect on the supply. Does that make sense? Hopefully. So we come back here to the question, if workers are going to leave the pencil labor market to go into the pen labor market, it's going to decrease the supply of labor, shifting the curve into the left. Question 9, just as the demand for labor in a given market is derived from the value marginal product of labor, the demand for land in a given market, like say agriculture, is derived from the value marginal product of that land. So hopefully that was pretty straightforward. And this is just the idea that even though we spent most of our time talking about the value marginal product of labor and labor as the factor of production that we were considering, any other factor of production, land or capital, could have the same, has the same relationship to its productivity, has the same analysis. A market where one buyer can set the price for a good is known as a monopsony. So a monopoly is when there's one seller. Monopsony is when there is one buyer. And we had a little discussion of that in the discussion thread for that chapter. So if you go back, if you have some more questions about monopsony, it's not a huge thing. It was just basically a couple of points about it in the discussion and in that PowerPoint slides. It's not the biggest idea, but it is interesting to think about. Question 11, imagine the government opens a school for solar panel installation. In the second year it is opened, 2,000 new solar panel installers graduate from the program, entering the job market. What effect would this have on the labor market for solar panel installers? And this is really similar to what we talked about with the pen makers and pencil makers, right? So we're seeing new workers enter a job market. That means there are more people supplying their labor to that job market. That's going to increase the supply of labor, shifting the curve to the right, right? So more workers in a labor market means more labor supplied. Hopefully that makes sense. A business consulting firm hires Samar because she was a math major in college. Her new job does not require any of the mathematics she learned, but the firm believes that anyone who can graduate with a math degree must be very smart. What is this an example of? And here we have some of the other determinants of wages, and this gets at the question about what the value of education is, whether it's that you're learning something, you're increasing your human capital attainment, or is it just a signal? And the trick here is that Samar's degree is in math, but the firm isn't going to use any of her math education. So that's telling us that this is signaling theory. In this case, education isn't increasing her productivity. It's just a signal to the firm that she might be a good worker. When recording devices were first invented more than 100 years ago, musicians could suddenly supply their music to large audiences at a low cost. The development, likely, that is a typo, likely increased the income of the best musicians and the income of average musicians. So the difference between the wages of average musicians and the best musicians are explained by superstar phenomenon. And that was the big example that we talked about. So really the idea of superstar phenomenon is when the technology is available for everyone to have the best of something, and that's the wrong one, he says. Sorry about that, y'all. When the technology is available for everyone to have the best of something and people want the best, then we're going to see wages between the best performers or the best workers in that industry be very different from the wages of the average. So think about if you'd rather spend $50 going to a concert with your favorite musician or get 10 $5 tickets to an elementary school performance, right? People would rather consume the best quality good, and the technology is available for us to hear the best music or see the best acting or watch the best sports and athletes. Which of the following is not a cause of above equilibrium wages? Human capital, unions, minimum wage laws, and efficiency wages. So human capital is going to be the answer because human capital actually contributes to our marginal productivity, so that wouldn't be above equilibrium. But unions, minimum wage laws, and efficiency wages are all situations where workers might get higher wages than their productivity. Question 15, Jana runs a small manufacturing company. She pays her employees about twice as much as other firms in the area, even though she could pay them less and still recruit all the workers she wants. She believes higher wages make her workers more loyal and more hardworking. What is this an example of? So we've got unions, superstar phenomenon, human capital theory, and efficiency wages. This is an example of efficiency wages. Remember, efficiency wages are when firms pay workers more than the equilibrium wage because they want to attract the best workers. They want to have them work harder without having to monitor them. They want more loyalty. They want to reduce turnover. Or in the developing world, efficiency wages can also increase the health and well-being of workers and make them more efficient. So efficiency wages are paying workers more to reduce turnover, increase their effort, and attract the best workers and improve the health of your workers. Question 16. After getting a degree in engineering, Tona starts working for an engineering firm. She makes more money than Chris, who started working at the same time but has a degree in music. This is an example of... This is another one of our education ones, right? Is it signaling theory or is it human capital theory? In this case, we're talking about two people who both have a degree, but the person with the degree in engineering can use that training to be more productive at the engineering firm. So this isn't signaling theory. If it was signaling theory, then Chris's degree would have as much value as Tona's. But because Tona's degree is a training that she is using for her company, engineering degree that she can use to help an engineering firm, it's going to be human capital theory. So her education is not a signal, it's an actual skill set that she's acquired that's going to help her do her job better. And that's the difference between human capital and signaling theory. Human capital is skills and information that you are going to use. Signaling theory is, well, I got a degree in Spanish, so now I'm ready to work in an office. Something like that. Question 17. An increase in the price of sandwiches would have what effect on the market for sandwich makers? This is a value marginal product of labor curve. So remember, the value marginal product of labor is equal to the marginal product of labor times the price of the good, and it's going to also give us our labor demand curve, right? Yay! So if we see the price of a good go up, so the price of sandwiches goes up, that's going to be an increase in the value marginal product of labor. That's going to shift demand out. It's going to shift the demand curve out to the right. It's going to raise wages for workers and mean more workers get hired in the market. Question 18 says, Ted leaves his job as a high school math teacher and returns to school to study the latest developments in computer programming, after which he takes a higher paying job at a software firm. This is an example of human capital theory, signaling theory, compensating differential, or superstar phenomenon. This is another question that looks at the trade-offs between human capital theory and signaling theory of education. So we have to ask ourselves, Ted's education is in computer programming, and now he's getting a higher paying job at a software firm. Is that because his education is a signal, or is it because his training in computer programming makes him better at software engineering? Because his education is related to the field he's working in, it's going to be human capital theory. It's not just a signal. He couldn't have done that job when he was a high school math teacher because he didn't have the training. But getting the training in computer programming makes him eligible for a job and able to do a job that works in software. Sound good? Make sense? There wasn't really a question on here about compensating differential. So you want to remember that compensating differential is when workers are paid more for a non-monetary difference in jobs. So the best example I like is the difference between driving a garbage truck and a flour truck. You have to pay people more to drive the garbage truck. You can think about night shift versus day shift work. People are going to get paid more to do night shift work. So hopefully that gives you guys a sense of what those questions were about, what it meant, what all was part of it. If you didn't do super well on this assignment, don't worry about it because it was only 18 of the points come from answering the questions. The rest of the points actually come from just taking it. If you haven't taken it yet, you can still take it for credit. Let me know what questions you have, and I'll talk to y'all later. Thanks.